We have achieved great things. We have made giant leaps. We've gone far beyond what we thought was possible. But we have only just begun. Our future in space is unlimited, and it will benefit all humanity. But it will take hard work, new technologies, advanced financing models, and enabling public policy. The Beyond Earth Institute is creating a policy and legal framework to enable the creation of economically vibrant communities beyond Earth. We will engage all stakeholders on critical policy issues: property rights in space, norms of behavior, conflict resolution protocols, filling the technology gaps, exploring new financing mechanisms, and making space settlement an agreed goal of the U.S. and its allies. Beyond Earth is committed to the true purpose of why we go to space. Join us on this journey.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Beyond Earth Institute webinar. I'm very excited about today's program that's titled Redshift, China, and the Threat to U.S. Leadership in Space. My name is Steve Wolf. I'm the president of the Beyond Earth Institute. I'm very excited about today's program because really for the first time that we're partnering with the Commercial Space Federation to put this forward. And the program is largely related to a recently released report by the CSF called Redshift, the Acceleration of China's Commercial and Civilian Space Enterprise. So it's very timely, and obviously there's a great deal of discussion around this topic. So I'm looking forward to a great program. Before we get into that, though, I do have just a couple of announcements to make. The registration for the Beyond Earth Symposium is now open. We're very excited about this. It is coming up February 24th and 25th. This will be the fourth annual symposium for BE, and it's going to be bigger and better than ever. We are going to be again at the American University Washington College of Law. So please go to our website, the beyondearthsymposium.org. I'll put the link in the chat field and encourage you to take a look. We are working on our speakers and so forth, and which will include Pete Worden, Bobby Alal, former associate administrator of NASA, and Martine Rothblatt, who is a brilliant entrepreneur and has been a lifetime space advocate. So we're looking forward to their participation as well as many others. And then finally, next month, we are going to have another webinar, and which I'm very excited about. With this webinar, November 23rd, I believe, and you'll look for the announcement on that. We're going to take a step back. We're going to ask the big question, why? And I'm titling this program "A Conversation with Space Evangelists." And this is, we're going to get philosophical. My friends, Frank White, Rick Tumlinson, Loretta Whitesides will be joining me on this. And if you know who they are, you know that they are big thinkers and visionaries. And I think this kind of conversation is important to contextualize a lot of what we're doing near term and long term in space. So I encourage you to join us for that particular program. So with that, I want to let's get into the discussion today. I'm going to ask our own Courtney Stad to introduce the program. He was instrumental in putting this together, working with CSF. And then I'm very excited that Lauren Andrade will be moderating it. Lauren is our Director of Marketing and Communications, and she's really the backbone of everything that we do at Beyond Earth. Without her, none of this really would be possible. So I'm really excited, and she happens to be one of the best moderators I've ever seen. So I'm excited about that. So with that, let's spotlight and bring in Courtney Stad to introduce the program.
All right. Am I spotlighted?
You sure are.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to join Steve Wolf in welcoming you all to today's discussion. Just recently, I had the pleasure of attending a Commercial Space Federation forum on Capitol Hill, where where the Redshift report on China's space efforts was unveiled. Using only publicly available information, this timely and important study sheds light on the breathtaking and frankly sobering progress being made by China's space program. Kudos to Dave Gavosa, president of CSF, and Alicia Brown, one of our speakers today, who's the executive director, for their leadership in initiating this very important study. Frankly, it should be priority reading for all members of Congress and staff, along with other officials in the executive branch involved with US, China, and space. During this Capitol Hill forum, Jonathan Roll, the principal architect of the report and one of today's key panelists, provided an exceptionally compelling overview of what is arguably the most sophisticated and determined strategic competitor the United States and the West have faced in modern history. So when Alicia Brown of CSF suggested that Beyond Earth host a follow-on webinar focusing on the report and its broader implications, it was truly a no-brainer. We're fortunate today to have Greg Autry, one of the nation's leading authorities on the challenges posed by China. Many of you know Greg from his works, Death by China and Red Moon Rising, which join his substantial body of scholarly research and policy engagement on the geopolitical and commercial dimensions of space. We're also joined by my longtime friend, Jim Frelk, who brings decades of hands-on experience as a true pathfinder in building companies across the commercial space sector. Jim has witnessed firsthand how China's ambitions are reshaping the global marketplace. He's also co-editor of Contested Space, a compelling and eye-opening collection of papers exploring how the United States can sustain its national security and commercial leadership in an increasingly contested and competitive space environment. For those who would like to dig deeper, the links will be made available in our chat room, so you can download Redshift, Contested Space, Red Moon is Rising, and I think you'll find all of them to be extraordinarily important and eye-opening reads. Speaking personally, as someone who grew up during the Cold War, I find this discussion both familiar in some ways and profoundly new. The US-Soviet space rivalry of that era, yeah, it was intense, but in retrospect, it may almost look like child's play compared to the complexities we face today. The difference, of course, is that our economy with China is so deeply intertwined. And further, China has quickly developed a formidable military and is not shy about using it, as we see in the South China Sea, where it intimidates all who dare enter its declared sphere of control. So as we develop strategies to counter China's growing presence in space, I also humbly suggest that we must also perhaps recognize that there may be areas where competition and cooperation, maybe, can coexist. For example, ensuring harmonized pressurization standards in spacecraft and spacesuits could be vital in the event of an emergency rescue involving taikonauts, astronauts, or cosmonauts, or other foreign national astronauts. Accordingly, there may be opportunities, maybe, to pursue mutually beneficial safety and sustainability measures, even as we remain clear-eyed about the strategic competition before us. Ultimately, today's discussion, led by the multi-talented Lauren Andrade, as Steve mentioned, who heads indeed a number of our key Beyond Earth initiatives, is about how the United States can lead wisely, strengthening our innovation, protecting our values, and shaping a future in which space remains open, secure, while advancing Beyond Earth's vision of human communities in space at scale. And with that, again, thank you for joining us. And now I turn it over to you, Lauren.
Thanks, Courtney and Steve, for kicking us off. And good afternoon to everyone. Courtney gave us a little taste of some of the accolades that our panelists today have earned. And before we jump into, the real meat of today's discussion, I did want to give each panelist a couple of minutes to introduce themselves and to specifically share a bit about what has drawn them to this topic. And Jonathan, because, we're here to discuss your work, let's get started with you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Really appreciate it, and really appreciate this opportunity through Beyond Earth and everyone that's been involved in this process. Jonathan Roll, my day jobs are at Arizona State University, where I work in a number of capacities. We have an office called the New Space Initiative, which essentially connects the university and all of its assets and resources with private industry, specific around the space domain. So I work as a program manager and research analyst there. Outside of that, I also help lead a statewide group and committee of executive aerospace and defense leaders in the state of Arizona to try to sort of boost up this economy in this state to make the U.S. writ large more competitive. So that's sort of the context in which I authored this report in conjunction with CSF. And I would say the second piece of your question, what's drawn me to this is I've always been interested in the intersection, the interface of geopolitics and sort of emerging technologies. My background is public policy and political science with a sort of a smattering of the technical on the side. So I think there's no topic that's more salient, relevant, and urgent, perhaps, than navigating this other entity on the other side of the world who is accelerating in their technological pursuit and creates a new landscape, perhaps perpetually moving forward for geopolitics from the U.S. perspective. So fascinated about the topic and fascinated to solve it and or at least keep us progressing forward.
For sure. And Alicia, since you're also kind of the person who brought us all here together, can you share a little bit from your perspective and introduce yourself for everyone?
Yeah, thank you so much, Lauren, and thanks, Steve and the Beyond Earth Institute for co-hosting this event with us today. Yeah, so I mean, I think like many of you, we've been seeing articles for years now about China's progress in various areas of the space domain, whether it's their progress towards deep space exploration, what they're doing in LEO, or the proliferated satellite constellations that are going up and challenging US competitors. So the idea behind the report was to really put in one place an open source look at China's progress in civil and commercial space, to be able to measure, to say, this is the goals that the Chinese government has laid out for their space programs. This is why they are putting so much effort behind these, how it plays into their broader international goals. And then, to have a look in time to say, this is the progress they're making along those goals. And then to say, okay, well, what are the implications for US policymakers? And towards the end of the report, there's a set of recommendations authored by CSF with the input of our member companies to say, if we really want to make sure that the US remains a leader in all of these different areas, these are the steps we need to take today to make sure that we do retain that leadership role. So thanks again, and I look forward to talking a little bit more about the report and some of our recommendations.
Awesome, for sure. So do I. And getting to our last two panelists here as we get ready to really dive into this. Greg, can you tell us a little bit about, this topic from your perspective? I know it's something that you're very passionate about.
I became passionate about this topic 25 years ago when traveling in China, and I began to talk to people who were not being controlled by my handlers in the Chinese Communist Party as a visiting student at that time. Kind of went off the reservation, and they showed me what was really going on in the background, and they flat out told me back in 2000, 2001, we're not your friend. Our government is planning to essentially eradicate Western institutions and thinking from China and from the world, but they are going to utilize your economic gifts to us to do that. And I began to clearly see that Deng Xiaoping's 24-character strategy, which essentially said that China would grow and build their capabilities while hiding them from the rest of the world in order to forward the Chinese Communist Party's goals, was what was really going on. I became concerned about it in space back in 2007, 2008, when China launched an anti-satellite test that created the worst debris field that we've ever had to deal with in LEO. And I looked more into that and saw a lot of writings in the Chinese military literature about intending to take America's space capabilities away from us because they were quite aware that was the one tool that gave us supremacy over the globe. And then just beyond that, I'm a student of history, and I'm terribly concerned about who carries the mantle of human thought to the solar system. We're at a moment that is very similar to the age of exploration, and in that age, it made a real difference whether you were colonized by the Inquisition or the people who brought the Enlightenment forward. As far as your outcomes politically and economically, hundreds of years later, and I don't want to see Xi Jinping thought spread throughout the solar system.
Perfect. There we go. All problem solved. Last but not least, we've got Jim, and if you could give us a little bit about your background and what's drawn you to this topic. And dare I say, we're a little bit ahead of schedule, so I'm excited to really dig into this topic after this.
Awesome. Although I do hate talking about myself, but I started, I think I interestingly started on the national security side, and working up on the Hill. I was nicknamed Mr. SDI during those Reagan years, and working on missile defense things and other things space related. I've had an interesting career in working at think tanks of really guys who are much brighter than me from a technical perspective, and I was the chimp test and translating the scientific studies into things that laymen and policymakers could understand and act upon. I've also served in industry as well as government in a variety of different capacities at NASA and NASA headquarters, but also as the director of the Office of Space Commerce back when it reported to the secretary. And as we won the Cold War against the Soviet Union, I would say, as the wall came down, doing a lot of things to lead missions over to Russia very early on in those days. One of the things that Courtney knows so well is that it was my office that worked on changing the law to allow commercial high-resolution satellite imagery to go forward. So I wound up by tossing a pass in the government, changing the law, and then working at Lockheed to create space imaging, and then Worldview and Ball Aerospace and Earthwatch, now known as kind of Maxar, as everything kind of got rolled up later on, and creating a commercial industry. So I've seen both sides of it. Throughout all of this, I've spent time going to China and seeing the developments, as well as being very aware of Russia's capabilities from a national security perspective. And we're kind of history does sort of repeat itself, and we're again at that moment where we're feeling the pressure. Space, not only from a national security perspective, is absolutely critical to our security as a nation, our allies' security as a nation, and the progress of freedom. But I would also say that economically, it's proved to be quite important as an infrastructure and capability for things that people don't even realize are based upon space capability, whether it's position, navigation, and timing, communications, right along the way. And I would say that is now extending. This competition is extending with the Russians and the Chinese, which I kind of call the axis of evil in the world. It's extending both economically and from a national security perspective into space and beyond to cislunar. And my interest in this is my kids' future, my grandkids' future. It's critically important that we get these things right. There are moments in history where it's critically important to make the right steps to ensure freedom's future in space. This is not just an exploration moment in expanding freedom into space. It's also a national security moment that will impact peace, security, and deterrence in the near term. So thank you for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all. And I look forward to the program and being with you guys today.
Thanks, Jim. Usually when webinars like this do introductions, they're, not that helpful. But I think with this group and the reason why I wanted everyone to individually kind of tell us about their vantage point is because we are really so well equipped on this webinar to have a discussion about this topic. And we've got some incredible minds on on this panel to have this discussion today. So to start us off, Jonathan, first of all, congratulations on publishing the Redshift report.
Thank you.
It's an immense body of work, and it really lays out, China's ambitions and strategy to exceed U.S. capabilities in space and really measure the progress that China is making towards those goals. Can you walk us through some of the report's key findings?
Absolutely. And I think probably best way to do that is to illustrate through just amplify through some of the slides that we developed when we've presented this so far around the circles of policymakers and decision makers. So let me do that real quick and make sure that we can see my screen. All right, excellent. Well, thanks again for the opportunity, and thanks for everyone who's joined us and who's listening in, who's interested in this topic. Obviously, that means it's important to you or fascinating to you from your standpoint. It certainly was for myself and for the CSF leadership and for the team of sort of the data analysts and consultancies that we leverage data from, as well as my fellow authorship team as we went through this process to try to do what is at simultaneously a snapshot of where China is now, a track record of what they said they were going to do and where they've ended up so far, and then also sort of a comprehensive compendium, if it were, of that point in time that people can rely on. We realized that we didn't see that across the industry quite yet, so that was our endeavor. And we've arrived at this report, and though the report has lots of stories in it, there's a few key findings that we wanted to sort of pull out of it. So, before I jump into this graphic real quick, as Alicia kind of outlined, the report asked the question of track record. What did they say they were going to do? What did they shift to make that happen? What were the outcomes? And then what are possible risks? And then it finishes out that sequence of questioning with sort of policy recommendations, right? But what we realized is that the segments of the industry that we dug into in the report had key findings that sort of matched each other. And so some of the key findings I'm going to talk about now are horizontal and that they sort of transcend the different segments. So that's where I'm going to start. I have 5 of them here that we'll discuss to kind of kick us off. And first and foremost is what you see on the screen. This is an investment graph. This is an investment graph that shows the commercial uptick and the commercial money going in, or the money going into the commercial sector. Yes, there's an asterisk next to commercial in China, but defined within certain bounds. This is the investment track record so far for the last 10 years. And so the takeaway here is that I'll give the takeaway and then I'll sort of match the graphic to that takeaway. The takeaway that the report has sort of found is that China is using a hybrid toolkit. And what we mean by that is they've sort of always, in rough terms, been known to be able to scale. Volume was sort of a forte, but not that all-important spark of innovation of building something new, right? There was a lot of copycatting. What we feel we see now to a degree is a bit of that spark, and that would be what we consider sort of a Western economic toolkit. So, and here's the danger, right? If they're able to innovate and use a Western toolkit to some degree, to innovate and then match that with their toolkit to scale, that is a formidable prospect. All right, so what are we looking at in this graph? Like I said, this is commercial investment over 10 years. Essentially, in 2014, there was a regulatory body in China that released a document that said we are going to open the space domain, the space sector, to a degree, to private ownership and private investment. That was at the end of 2014. So the next year is when you see this uptick in investment going in and then results. That's where you're at on the left of the screen, 2015. It's mostly in SATCOM investment. But I want to point out just 2 stories to highlight the value of this. In 2020, there was another regulatory body that changed the aperture and the opening possibility for entrepreneurs per se in China to get into Earth observation. And that's when you see the Jilin EO constellation come into being. That's right here in the middle of the screen. The last one I'll point out here is at the very end. This was just last year. Once again, a regulatory body, the Ministry of Industry and Innovation Technology, they had signaled that they were going to give the green light to SATCOM operators to build out mega constellations. We knew this was coming already because we saw the filings. with ITU. And once that happened, immediately you see almost $1 billion go into two companies, really one company that now is matches to be a rival against SpaceX's Starlink, right? So they changed the policy, they threw money in, and then you have these constellations built. Let me move to the next key finding here. This one again is domestic, and it has to do with the proliferation of multiple localities where we see activity. And it's not just launch, it's not just manufacturing, right? It's this confluence that in the policy world we call the triple helix. It's a bit of a theoretical thing, but really what it means is when industry, government regulatory apparatuses, and academia or the educational apparatus all overlap in a way that accelerates exponentially the level of innovation that's possible. So, what is the big takeaway? That the infrastructure surge that we are seeing in China could upend a degree of what we perceive as our lead. And I'm sure Greg and others are going to get into this. Are we ahead? Yes. Can we stay ahead? Absolutely. But we're seeing China accelerate. Let me just point out a couple things here. So this graphic is normally horizontal in the report. It costs almost, I think, 2 pages is the way we printed it. And it really gets into the fine detail. In short terms, China now has 7 launch locations, 3 inland, 2 on the coast, 1 that's purely private, and then 2 that are sea-based in the Yellow Sea and the South China Sea. So they have multiple locations, which allow multiple trajectories, and then can facilitate both private and civil and military launch across a family of vehicles. Manufacturing is off the charts. There's 50 some odd satellite manufacturing facilities and locations around the country. The last thing I'll say on this key finding is that in our country we value competition. And we like to galvanize competition internally, right? Because if you do that, then kind of what rises to the top are companies and hubs that have really cut their teeth and found their way. Florida, Texas, California, I'd like to think Arizona now, all in competition to some degree with each other, which makes the US stronger, more robust, innovatively. That is a bit of what we're seeing now in China. It is proliferated across the country in metro areas. Provinces are competing against each other for providing investment to companies, trying to seduce them to come to their region, to come to their city, giving financial benefits, policy benefits, etc. So again, a bit of a Western toolkit. All right, let me shift gears real quick. And I think I've been going for about 5 minutes or so, if I'm not mistaken. You said we're ahead of schedule. I don't want to go too deep into all the topics because we got some really great conversation ahead of us. So you just give me the hook if you want me to be a bit more succinct. But let's get into the external facing piece of this, because both of those prior key findings were more internal. What you're looking at on screen right now is a map that we developed with Bryce Tech and a significant amount of data from Orbital Gateway Consulting, as well as our own research of the countries that have engaged in some sort of space activity that China labels under their BRI, their Belt and Road Initiative, as Space Silk Road or Space Information Corridor activity. Now, there's a lot of countries that are highlighted, and the immediate question is, a few of these look, are our allies, and so there could be concern there. Now, 2 points to that. Just like the BRI, the Chinese use the BRI fairly loosely. When projects are successful, it's a BRI project. When they're not so successful, it's like, oh, that was never part of the initiative. The same is true to a degree we've found, or the reporting's found, with the SIC, with the Space Silk Road. And so some of the projects that may be very sort of innocuous surface level talks, that's a category that we found of sort of interaction. China's going to consider that part of their progress in their Space Silk Road activity, with some of our European allies there. But that's not the case with most of the countries that are highlighted here. A lot of them are actual build outs of, or build to order satellites, launching satellites, building ground stations, which often come with the build out of a satellite. I'm thinking about countries in South America and Africa, or in cases like Egypt or Pakistan, full facilities In Egypt now, the new sort of space city and center that China has built out from the ground up for them also houses the African Space Agency. So there's lots of room to ask questions or be a bit concerned, especially when the infrastructure itself has been built in that way. They're exporting their manufacturing ability and their rules and regulations, their standards and their technical specs through this effort. It's diplomacy, it's soft power, and it's picking up. So the last thing I'll say on that is that this is an ongoing project that deserves its own analyst team at USCC, I think, the Security and Commission for US and China, that can just focus on this, in my opinion. Let's move on. So we wanted to touch a little bit on activity in Leo. And so the concept for this infographic here is we wanted to see what the intent is for the near future for international participation at Tiangong, at the Chinese space station. So we bounded some years and we looked at what the commitments were from different countries, or we'll say researchers from different countries that plan to go up to Tiangong. Most of these, and I'll qualify, most of these have not gone up yet. But the value here, though, is that Tiangong, the current one that's in orbit, is the third iteration of Tiangong. The first one was sort of a test ground. The second one did have some international participation as far as research experiments that were conducted by Chinese taikonauts aboard. So there has been engagement before. There's no reason to think that some of these countries in the left column are not going to participate in Tiangong's activities. And I'd say that's true even if we have our commercial stations up. Let's look at the right column because there's a lot more countries there as you'd expect. Again, what we've done here is we've bounded the years and we've said, let's look horizontally across the rows. What kind of science experiments and what kind of science is being done or will be done aboard Tiangong? And let's find an equivalent data set on ISS during this period of projects that have been happening or will happen, and what countries are engaged. So you would expect to see more countries, way more countries on ISS. Are there maybe some on here that aren't quite caught? I think there's always room to be improved in sort of the analysis and the takeaway here. Here is the big takeaway, though. Tiangong is ready to absorb a degree of orbital science. If there's not a competitor, they are ready to go. If there is a competitor, I think they're still going to march forward, trying to court countries that want to do orbital science. Let's keep moving. This is the fifth key finding that I'll kind of kick our conversation off with. This graphic is probably more familiar to folks around the space domain, especially policy folks. This is a comparative map of countries that have signed on to Artemis Accords or the International Lunar Research Station Agreement, the ILRS, which is Russia and China's sort of pseudo equivalent. And then a few countries that you can see in the middle there that are hedging their bets, right? And what we'd really like to highlight if we do this report, again in a year from now, is detail the timeline of exploration activity that this insinuates, because that's actually the big takeaway here. It's about deadlines and milestones. And so I'll just point out just a few, because I know we're going to talk about them here in our bigger discussion, and then I'll hand the mic back over to you, Lauren. The Chinese have ambitions. They've made them public. They've documented them, and they've said them to the world. I'm talking about commercial and civil, not military. In those documents and those plans, there have been some sort of keystone milestones that they've pointed to. And a number of them, a big number of them, they've hit. And they still have some ahead of them. So I'll give two examples for what they've hit, two examples of what they're envisioning to do. In 2020, it was a true race to Mars, right? There was multiple countries that were heading to Mars. And two of them were sending rovers, the US and China. Those all got there in essentially early 2021. This was the target that China had, and they nailed it. They were the second country to make a soft landing on the Mars surface, and I think we'll talk about this more later. That's a phenomenal feat. It was on time according to their timeline. Year later, 2022, Artemis 1 is on the pad, right down at the Cape, and Tiangong 3, or the current Tiangong, finishes its last sort of capsule integration. That was the plan. That's when it was going to happen. When Artemis was on the pad, they recrewed it, they recargoed it, sort of finished all, setting it up so that it was fully functional and in their terms, fully operational. And this was according to plan. All right, so this is the last bit. 2 deadlines are coming up. They've hit a lot of their deadlines before. If an organization or country keeps telling you they're going to do something and they're going to do it on this time and they do it, there's reason to believe or take seriously these upcoming deadlines. 2030. 2030 is when China says that they're going to put a taikonaut on the moon. We have our own plans. We're going to discuss that. But 2030, they're telling us loud and clear, 2030 is the date. 2031, the next year, a rocket or series of spacecraft that launch in 2028 are going to, 3 years later in 2031, bring back samples from the Mars surface. That would be a first in humanity. Now, the US gets there first and also does it, then it'll be a second in humanity. Still be exciting for them, though. So milestones, they hit them on time, and they're telling us publicly what they are. I'm going to leave it there. There's many more key findings we could sort of tease out in this discussion. I'm going to pull the slides back off and let everyone else, including Dr. Autry, fill in the details that I, missed or overstated. So.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think you might know a thing or two about this topic. With that, I'm really curious to hear from you, Alicia. The Redshift report was commissioned by the Commercial Space Federation, and the recommendations in it were written by CSF. Why did CSF feel that there was a need for this report? And could you walk us through some of those key recommendations, especially the ones that are really salient to you?
Sure. And thanks, Lauren. And thanks again, Jonathan. It's always great to hear the overview of the report. I feel like I learn something new every time. I think for several years now in DC, for anyone who spends time, especially on the Hill, China and China's space ambitions has kind of been this big boogeyman, I would say, for the last 5 or 6 years in particular. It's been this motivating factor for why the US also needs to maintain our foothold and strong international leadership role in space. And the report kind of details or hints at what are some of the implications for if we do lose that leadership. So we really wanted to make this as a tool for policymakers to, again, measure what has China promised they're going to do, noting that they tend to always meet those deadlines and meet those goals, and then measure where they are along those process, they're meeting those goals. I think the report finds that the US is largely still ahead in most areas. The report, beyond just laying out what China's general space ambitions are, takes a deep dive into 6 different areas, things like launch and re-entry, remote sensing, LEO, space exploration. And I think we generally find that we have the tools to remain ahead. We can out-innovate them. That is one thing that our system, has worked really well for us in the past. But how do we make sure that we can still rely on US innovations to keep leading the way? And I would say our recommendations fall into kind of a couple buckets of things. It's making sure that the regulatory environment really does allow commercial space to operate. There was I think it was Bill Gerstenmaier who testified a couple of years ago that it shouldn't ever be the paperwork that keeps a rocket on the pad. We should never be in that kind of environment. And so there's a number of recommendations to various regulators, DOT, FCC, Office of Space Commerce, about how we can make sure we have a set of common sense regulations that protect the public, protect things like sustainability that are important. We certainly don't want to be like China, where we're completely ignoring environmental concerns or dropping, rocket bodies on our population. But what are those common sense regulations that protect the public and allow us to make progress? And I'd say the second set of recommendations are focused on the government agencies that aren't regulators, but are really partners in space exploration. So really looking at NASA and making recommendations for how we can maintain leadership in low Earth orbit as we're transitioning to the ISS and building new commercial space stations. How can we make sure that we really have a seamless transition there so that we, NASA, can continue to do research in low Earth orbit? We can continue to build this incredible low Earth orbit, truly commercial economy that's coming, and how we can do so with international partners as well so that we maintain that global leadership position. And we also make a number of recommendations around kind of the Artemis program and Moon to Mars exploration in deep space. It's pretty clear as we look at, China is said they're going to land on the moon by 2030. At this point now, the Artemis 3 mission is, I think, 2028 is what the secretary said on Monday. It's clear that time is of the essence. And I think what we can also count on is that we don't have unlimited resources as NASA or the US government to put toward this. So what is the best way we can achieve these goals? And I think that we've seen tremendous success with public-private partnerships and NASA programs over the last 10 years. Almost every new program that NASA is implementing in the human space exploration realm is a public-private partnership. So making recommendations about how we can continue those and even improve those partnerships. And this is actually a new area that CSF is also doing some research around to really make sure, as we're moving more and more towards public-private partnerships, how do we structure those in the best way to benefit both the government and the commercial space industry?
Thanks, Alicia. And, with that and with understanding kind of the US focus a bit more, with what you and Jonathan have kind of outlined, I want to shift a little bit to understand the other perspective here. So, Greg, can you help us understand China's perspective here on space and tell us a little bit more about why space is such a priority for the CCP?
Yeah, I think the historical factor is super important here. I mentioned the outcomes of civilizations during the age of exploration, but a lot of people forget that China had a massive exploration effort very early in the 15th century, right before the Europeans began their great age of sail discovery. They made the unfortunate decision based on the choices of bureaucrats in the Central Court to end that exploration mission. They had gone so far as throughout India, throughout the Middle East, Africa, brought giraffes back to China. They were very close to going around the Cape of Good Hope and arriving in the New World, probably. Some people think they did that. I doubt that. But nonetheless, it was entirely within their capabilities to colonize the New World of almost 100 years before the Spanish arrived there. That would have changed everything in human history, obviously, and the Chinese understand that that was a huge policy mistake that was made then. They do not intend to repeat it, because not only did they miss out on acquiring influence and wealth around the world, they were in fact then subjugated by the Europeans who had that wealth and influence in a period they call the Century of Humiliation, which actually lasted a lot longer than a century. They don't want to repeat that. That's one of their motivations. It's very clearly part of their space policy. They do indeed want to carry Xi Jinping thought to the solar system. They want to grab the resources in cislunar space and use those to benefit China as they perceive China. They intend to find materials, energy resources, and military advantage in space. And all of this is fairly openly covered in their literature. And frankly, if it wasn't for the fact that I find their system and their ideology reprehensible, I would have to admire it. I wish that we had that level of cohesion going on in the West together, or even in the US, to face up to that. And as Jonathan mentioned, their ability to execute cannot be underestimated and or denied. They say when they're going to do things, they do those things, and they do them well. In fact, they've been landing landers on the moon and doing sample returns, to things that we seem to be having a lot of trouble doing. This is something that, as noted before, I think we're entirely capable of overcoming if we simply have the political resolve to coordinate the strengths of our free market system, which is, as noted earlier, much more likely to produce results because of the innovative capabilities we have, which are generally repressed by the communist system. Again, I think they'll continue to execute, and most of what they do, they begged, borrowed, or stole from the Russians or us, but that doesn't make a difference. They integrate it well, and they make it work. This is a clear and present danger to the U.S. in space and eventually to all the Western world on Earth.
So to tease that point out just a little bit, in your perspective, is China posed to pull ahead to the U.S.? And if so, what do we actually have to do to avoid
if things continue as they are currently, I suspect that in 5 years you have a Chinese space station with a couple of Americans going by in a Dragon capsule, waving at the Europeans who are attaching their modules to that station. I suspect you'll see Chinese Russian, although I don't think the Russians are contributing much in reality, a base being built on the moon because they said that they're going to do that. And it's unclear to me where we will be at that point ourselves. We need a real sense of alacrity in order to deal with this. Now, the good news is competition is good. It spurs the best in both competitors. What we don't want, of course, is for this to descend into conflict in any way. So nothing I say, I think, should imply that I'd like to see any kinetic battle going on with the Chinese. What I want to realize is there are resources that we both want access to, and there's a future for humanity that we both envision, and we should be doing our damnedest to make sure that we are out front and doing it.
Thanks, Greg. And Jim, Greg really teed you up well for this question. While this report doesn't specifically focus on China's military programs, that isn't to say that civil and national space programs aren't entirely linked. They absolutely are, and that's especially true in China. Can you help us understand a little bit the evolving landscape of space as a warfighting domain and how China and others may challenge U.S. security in that space?
Happy to. So we have to take the Chinese at their word. Xi has already indicated that and designated space as a domain of warfare. And I'm not surprised because as Greg just talked about the expansion, you might say, of Western civilization into the New World and China's early decisions. What we brought with eventually is also a way of, you might say, enforcing norms of behavior that were consistent with Western civilization. And that happens through actually national security means. And so, they have a two-pronged effort, both to commercially take advantage of space and surpass the United States and the Western civilization if they can, to be the dominant provider of commercial capabilities that are critical to economic growth and strategic growth for nations. But they also want to make sure that they are controlling and establishing the norms of behavior. And you can see that they show you how they do that already in the South China Sea, right? Building islands ain't much different than building a space station or a base on the moon, right? And so these are zones of influence. The good news with the free market system and the laws that we've established, it creates, I think, the appropriate innovation combined with freedom that creates a society and a world that, in our view, is more peaceful, quite honestly. And so that's what we're facing. So, and from a national security perspective, everything from LEO, GEO, all the way to cislunar is being contested, as I mentioned. Just in recent reports by the Space Force, you can look at what they issued in August of 2024, where they talk about the U.S. still being number one, but China being number two in national security space. And they give us an example in 2023, there were 66 launches by the PRC. 217 payloads were launched, I believe, and half of those were national security assets for them, ISR satellites, right? And the exponential growth that you're talking about in this capability since 2015, right? The number of, you might say, satellites in orbit that they've launched and are operating has increased by 560%, right? So it's about 820 satellites during that time period. 490 of them are ISR national security assets for them. They also have a very expansive ASAT program. They've tested ASATs on satellites in LEO. They demonstrated they can kinetically destroy satellites in GEO. They have ground-based lasers to put at risk the Western civilization satellites in crisis, right? They are fairly consistent in using and demonstrating in war games the use of jammers on GPS satellites and other things, right? Electronic warfare. So they're very prepared to enforce, you might say, China's rule, using the high ground of space, both from an economic perspective as well as a national security perspective. And I want to, everybody tends to focus on manned space, which is really important, and bases on the moon. What's critically important is the infrastructure that gets developed and who's using that infrastructure to enable, you might say, more permanent activities in space to occur. And I now work as an executive, and one of my responsibilities is at Intuitive Machines, where we're sending lunar landers to the moon on an annual basis and are about to launch the first of 5 combination data relay satellites with communication around cislunar. The folks at NASA actually are really forward-leaning in NASA Scan. I commend Kevin Coggins for all of his work and really changing the dynamics, because not all of it should be led by government activities. This partnership between leveraging commercial capabilities as well as financial markets in the West and our allies with national security needs becomes very important, and civil exploration needs becomes very important. And you might see it needs to be kind of a collective effort, both to establish the infrastructure and then protect the infrastructure that's necessary, not just to go to the moon or to Mars, but to create a more permanent operational capability that allows not just civil space activities to flourish and national security space activities to flourish, but allows commercial activities, which is really quite important, right? That, when you look at the history that Greg pointed out, that's the real advantage from the way we did exploration, the establishment of norms and laws of operation. It allows everybody to you might say, to play in a more peaceful way, and so that's really what's at risk. We're at that pivotal moment in history. Either we're going to take up the challenge, or as Greg says, we'll get passed, we'll get lapped. That's what we're facing. Not in a long period of time. I agree with Greg. We've got to get our act together. And that's what contested space really talks about. What policy and things that need to be put in place, what activities need to be put in place to really pull together civil, national security, and commercial, both, I would say, domestically here in the U.S., but also with our allies to succeed in this effort. It's really going to establish the future of geopolitics, and some have said astrogeopolitics going forward. Okay.
Yeah, for sure. Digging into this report and kind of thinking about all the things that you've just talked about in context here, the Redshift report really analyzes China's progress in a lot of specific space sectors. We've got spaceports and infrastructure, re-entry, remote sensing, space situational awareness, satellite comms, commercial LEO, space exploration. We've got all these different topics, and we don't have enough time in a 90-minute webinar to really dig deep into all of those. But
let's do 6 webinars. Let's do a series.
No, I do have to underscore that it is so important to realize the careful strategic planning that's going on the Chinese side versus the randomness to fill market opportunities that's going on in the U.S. without a coordinated government plan to ensure that we address each of those factors that we need based on our communal interests in civil and national space. We can't just randomly wait for somebody to address them, and we can't not look at those areas and make sure that we've created an enabling regulatory regime that encourages somebody to go there, and then investors are going to want to follow on.
Yeah, that was Greg. That was the intent of contested space. And I must say that while it's not on Amazon because it's for everybody for free, right? I would say that frankly speaking, it's been picked up by the policymakers and the leadership in this administration, and particularly the executive branch and the Hill, as a roadmap of the things we need to get coordinated around. At the end of the day here, quite simply put, we always have risen to the occasion. So I'm fairly confident that we can, but it's going to require I call it the coalition of the willing inside and outside the government, with our international partners, and with with commercial companies, to make this happen. I think we need to focus on the infrastructure for continuous operations. Yeah, I tend to view cislunar and the higher orbits as maintaining the high ground, both economically as well as from a national security perspective. So why is the moon so important to China and to ourselves? It is the high ground. I can put everything in orbit around the United States at risk from cislunar and moon bases. It's not just the economic, it is the high ground. Think of it also as the pathway to and from further exploration to Mars.
So I want to tag a few of you in. So I guess I'm going to ask a couple questions all in a row and tag y'all in. So, Jonathan, we hear a lot about, China landing taikonauts on the moon by 2030. And from you, I would really like you to dig in a little bit more on what the key pieces of infrastructure are that China is developing to, enable that progress. But then Alicia and Greg, kind of tying on to that, from both of you, I'm really curious to know if the Artemis program is actually poised to compete with what China's lunar plans are, and whether, you think that changes that need to be made, or do we need to just maintain course?
Do you want me to jump in first with the pieces and maybe just
Yeah,
in very brief terms say what the phases and steps are?
absolutely. Yeah, that'd be perfect.
Cool. Okay. Well, yeah, obviously the preceding bit of conversation here has really emphasized the value of infrastructure, right? And that's what the plans are all about. So there's two sets of plans in unison that sort of overlap that China's executing on. So the first is their what they call CLEP. It would be in English, it would be an acronym CLEP, CLEP. So that's the Chinese Lunar Exploration Program, the Chinese Lunar Exploration Program. And there's 5 phases to that. Right now they stand in phase 4. In the simplest terms, about 2 missions for each phase. The first 2 were orbiters doing orbital mapping. The second 2 were landers and rovers. That was sort of the exploratory piece. The third phase was and these are called the Chang'e missions within the CLEP sort of infrastructure. The Chang'e missions 5 and 6 were rovers and sample returns. Chang'e 5 returned samples from the near side. Chang'e 6 returned them from the far side, which was a first in civilization. So, a groundbreaking thing that they did on course in their lunar plans. So where we stand right now, and they haven't launched yet, but phase 4 of CLEP is robotic polar research and station preparation, essentially. A little bit of prospecting. The 5th and final stage of CLEP won't be a titled or named Chang'e mission, at least as of right now. It hasn't been publicly disclosed as such. It's essentially landing the astronaut, the taikonaut, on the moon. All right, so that's CLEP. Essentially 8 or 9 missions across a number of phases. And well, how does that overlap with this second timeline I'm talking about? The second timeline is the ILRS, the International Research Lunar Station. And this is the one in conjunction with Russia and now 11 other countries that have signed on. And that overlaps in that they claim, kind of like their BRI, their Belt and Road Initiative, that the prior work they've already done getting to the moon and the prior work that Russia's already done getting to the moon was actually the first successful phase of ILRS, or that we're seeing that in process. So ILRS has 3 phases. It's recon, and then construction, and then utilization. And where we stand right now is we will see their Chang'e missions to go do prospecting, and that will be both finishing their domestic lunar plans, and then they move into their international plan. So let me finish real quick by saying what kind of maybe the 3 or 4 key space platforms are that they're working on or they already have in place. So you have the QKO, probably butchering the pronunciation here, but it's the second generation sort of lunar relay satellite that's already in place in the lunar ecosystem there. You have the Mengzhou, which is China's next generation crewed spacecraft. It's intended for missions beyond low Earth orbit, obviously, and it's been doing, I believe it's, I was trying to check the news this morning, abort and escape tests successfully in the last couple months. Then you have the Lanyu lander system. That would be the one that actually goes down to the surface, also doing successful tests, sort of hops in the Hebei province, so proving out that technology. And finally, the LM-10 rocket, which is going to be the one that gets them there, at least for this portion. And so once again, tests going successfully on these four pieces of technology. Why don't I leave it there and I'll hand it off?
I'll jump in, I suppose, on Artemis. So obviously Artemis is the U.S. Program to return U.S. astronauts to the moon. There's a lot of focus, I think, on Artemis 3, that first mission to return to the moon, particularly this week, of course. Where I'm concerned is, are we making the right decisions to long-term compete with China? I think, I understand the political reasons for wanting to, quote unquote, beat them again, but are we making the decisions to, to not only beat them that one time, but to really build out that sustainable presence? And what I am a bit worried about is our planned cadence to go back to the moon. For years now, NASA's manifest for Artemis has shown eventually getting to, at best, one Artemis crewed mission a year. I don't think that that's enough to really build out a sustainable, robust presence on the moon and to accomplish all of these infrastructure goals that we have. I think that we need to really think about how we bring in new capabilities so that we have, a fleet of rockets, a fleet of capsules, a fleet of landers that can make sure that, again, assuming that our budgets are going to remain pretty flat for NASA, so that we can, have this robust cadence by bringing in more and more capabilities that aren't going to cost, a huge amount of money.
Part of that also is creating the same thing we have on Earth. I don't think people realize how important navigation and timing is to all of this and the permanent repeatable presence, how important communication is to that. I can tell you there are a lot of challenges in operating and landing on the moon without having a grid like we have in the United States and assistance on navigation and timing. So there's maybe the less glamorous blocking and tackling that needs to happen. But that's how you create economies and permanent presences, is with the infrastructure that needs to go in. And that includes launch services. You're absolutely right. It includes, you might say, advanced materials and autonomy for manufacturing and building things using the resources on the moon. There's also real estate problems. Everybody wants beachfront property because God ain't making any more of it. Same thing is true with Lagrange points and other things that create a permanent presence and a capability. China realizes that. They're moving to capture that infrastructure as well, because it's not just about the taikonaut getting there. How are you going to create the infrastructure to create a permanent presence and take advantage of that both economically and from a national security perspective?
Yeah, I'd like to address this. This is not a technical problem or an architectural problem, as everybody wants to be. This is purely a political will issue. It is important that we beat China to the moon, and more important that we beat China on the moon. And many of my friends will insist that the first part isn't necessary. We've already been to the moon, asked Lori Garber. We don't need to prove that again. Unfortunately, we kind of laid down the gauntlet. I was one of the people in the 2016 Trump transition team, said we're going to do this, right? And here we are 8 years later, and frankly, we're not ready to do this. That's not right. The Chinese are going to do it, and as Jonathan noted, they're going to do it and execute on time, and then they are going to rub our noses in the geopolitical poo that is created there. And turn on their propaganda machine. I mean, if you look at your social media feed, I bet you are seeing their propaganda machine right now that is rallying up against the trade situation that's going on, telling you how great China is. China's the future. When you see that Chinese taikonaut there on the moon with the communist flag, they are going to use that around the world the same way we did back in the 1970s to sway the perceptions of the world away from the American system to the Chinese system. It is important that not happen. And the other reason it's important that not happen is the more important thing of beating China on the moon with sustained commercial presence there is going to depend on the next Congress and the next White House. And we don't know who they are, but I see no reason to believe, looking at the suspects, that those folks are going to care about space very much or be at all interested in funding America's silver medal attempt to go to the moon. They will not understand the nuance of how important it is that we're doing it in a different and more sustainable, permanent way. They'll just understand they spent a lot of money and we didn't get there in time. So I am very concerned about this, and I take both of those things extremely seriously, being first and being best, right?
So thinking a little bit more and shifting ourselves a little bit more towards low Earth orbit specifically, and thinking about that threat piece that Greg really saliently brought up. Alicia, CSF represents many companies that work on commercial space stations, are doing research in LEO. Does China's activities represent a threat to those companies? And if so, in what ways?
Absolutely. It already is. They're obviously closely watching some of the policy decisions that are being made here as we're transitioning off ISS to commercial LEO destinations. There's a lot of talk about whether or not we would allow a gap in low Earth orbit and what the implications of those are. For the companies that are building the commercial space stations, all of which are a part of CSF, they are already seeing their potential customers being outreach to by China and to say, hey, it looks like there's potentially going to be a gap in the research you're doing on station, and when CLDs are going to be ready, why don't you come over to our station? And by the way, we'll heavily discount it, or we will give you a free ride to our station. Obviously, we'll see the first international astronaut from Pakistan visit the Chinese station. There's been heavy outreach, I think, to the European countries as well. And yes, that's a direct threat to those. That is the customer base for the future commercial space stations.
Thanks. And I want to bring in a question that has been kind of mulling over in the chat and kind of ask all of you this. We talk about this in incredibly broad terms a lot of the times, and it's very much government focused. This, how do we approach this threat? But when we think about the we as, the people that are actually on this call, the people that are running space companies that are working for space interest groups, et cetera, and as Timothy pointed out just now, the we that are in this webinar, how do we come together and make things happen in space for the benefits of free markets in the West? And also the kind of add on to that question that I thought was very interesting was, how do interested consulting engineers or the like put forward their ideas to industrialize the moon, to industrialize cislunar space? How do you get actual people involved in this? And so I kind of, all of you, if you want to share any of your thoughts on that.
I think the key thing, particularly in LEO, is to make sure that the financial models close for the operators there. And it doesn't make a difference how you adjust the rules of the CLD game if there's no money there. And what we need is anchor tendency that makes it worth it for vendors to put up the money that it takes to build either space stations or systems that essentially serve as space stations for moderate periods of time. We've got to have anchor tenancy. And frankly, I think the solution there is for NASA to work with other players domestically, other agencies that have an interest in this and should have an interest in this. The Space Force should have an interest in this, and to work externally with countries that actually have money and are willing to write checks. I'm thinking Japan. I'm thinking the UAE, South Korea, countries we maybe haven't thought about as much, to build a coalition of folks that are willing to write the checks for anchor tenancy on commercial stations for a period of time that is large enough for the investors who are waiting, frankly, for the right demand signal to roll in. They want to do this. They really do. But they're not going to do it if we just keep flipping the rules around and don't put the money out.
Oh, boy, Greg, I agree completely with that. The biggest thing we used to try to do when I was in the government is is indicate, the government has to be a good customer, and the marketplace, commercial companies have to be good providers. The biggest part of that, I would say, for industry and writing a business plan, tapping into financial markets to be able to leverage offtake contracts or service contracts in the future, is predictability in funding. The hardest part in everything that we're talking about is creating a stable coalition where the government is financing, you might say, budgeting for things in a stable way, because this is a priority. So getting a coalition together of folks legislatively that want to provide this stability and a pathway going forward. NASA itself has an extraordinary set of flexibilities in Space Act agreements and doing things in a different way. What it lacks, I would say, is, as a civil organization, the appropriate stability going forward from a financial perspective for folks to be able to invest around. You got on the national security side, everybody chasing after Golden Dome. You got 150, 160 billion dollars. It's going to create enough movement in the marketplace where folks will be able to invest in advance to capture contracts out of those areas. I think the last thing that Greg pointed out that I agree with wholeheartedly is that we've got to get, you might say, a coalition of the willing together between civil, national security, and commercial in the United States to come up with a kind of a coordinated approach to this as best we possibly can, and then incorporate our allies that have considerable capabilities in that plan. If we're able to do that, I think there's nothing that can really stop us. We can move faster because our ability to leverage financial markets. It needs a focus. I think the president's doing the right job in focusing on these things and getting government focused. He needs folks in place to execute on that plan.
Here, here. Yeah, if you put $1 billion a year for 5 years on the table as seed money, many billions of private capital will flow in to do what the United States of America needs done.
Yeah, otherwise we're relying upon the FARs, and what's the standard process? RFI, year later, RFP, 3 years later, 2 years later, maybe an award, then another protest, and so by the time you're into it, it's 4 years before you even get started, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That is not the
way. We can't operate that way in this environment. Can't operate that way.
I keep thinking back to something Alicia said a couple questions ago about how we're just not launching enough. Like there just isn't enough. And we're not going to be able to compete if we are not up there enough. And so Jim, but really all of you, the Redshift report, it highlights China's multiple launch sites and the new launch infrastructure that they have. And in the US, we are typically launching from 2 sites. We've got Florida, we've got California. And access to space is obviously a national security imperative. So, what recommendations do you have to ensure US access to space? Is there something that is the golden ticket, or is it a bunch of little pieces?
Yeah, I think what we have emerging is very interesting in the state of Texas and Arizona, in that you actually have state governments that are willing to invest money in the space area and create a competition among states, which I think is really important. That's also true for launch services, as well as a number of other things that is going on. Keep in mind that Texas has a GDP about the same size as France. You don't realize the economic power of some of these. California as well. I think the other thing that we need to look at is our allies. There are some geographic advantages, let's say in Australia and the Northeast, in Europe and other places that take advantage of. We have a natural set of allies on launch capabilities that we need to work with to expand those capabilities. But those things that we can control domestically, the regulatory process for establishing launch services has to be streamlined, right? Has to be. I think there's a combination of federal, state, and commercial money that can accelerate things quite rapidly if we allow that to happen in a natural way and incentivize it, right? Those things have to happen if we're going to have the kind of launch capacity that we're going to need, not just for day-to-day, but also where we need to surge. There's both a national security as well as an economic implication for it.
Thinking a little bit more. Greg, did you have something to add?
I want to say, obviously, we have a functional launch site in Texas. I think we can do more with that. We've got Kodiak. There are things we could be doing in the South Pacific. But more importantly, eventually we're going to launch inland. The Chinese launch inland all the time. Now they happen to drop toxic hypergolic booster segments onto villages and kill people. And that's not where we want to go. But SpaceX has got, I think, 400 plus successful launches in a row. ULA has a perfect record. I think we're getting to the point where we can investigate inland launch in a number of areas. Somebody mentioned Arizona. That's probably a place where that's fairly safe. But as long as you're not launching directly over a population center, I think we are to the point where inland launch needs to be taken seriously for vehicles that have been proven on the coast over and over.
Yeah, I think the regulatory piece is obviously really important to figure out here, but we do need some government investment in launch infrastructure. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that the Cape is going to reach its capacity as to how many launches it can support each day. And we really don't see a lot of actual federal investments in sites across the country. There's been some private investment, of course, but I think this is, it's a national security imperative. It's an imperative for our economy. I would like to, just like we see, ways to invest in airports across the country, ways to make federal investments in space infrastructure.
One good piece of news is Senator Moody in Florida worked to get spaceport bond investments, tax-free like investments in airports and ports and railroad and other infrastructure. So that's an important move forward. But you're right. I sit here in Florida and I look at how much more the Cape and Kennedy Space Center, for instance, could do if they had the funding and there was a serious government intent to treat them like the way we treat a significant airport. The infrastructure could be put on that real estate to make them operate at 10 times their capacity.
Also, I think we tend to focus on hardware, and that's great, the capability. But there are things, frankly, that this administration is focused on in AI that's critically important because of the distances that are involved and things that we're talking about beyond launch services. And the autonomy that's going to be needed, the autonomous operations, a number of things, AI becomes really important. I think data centers become very important in this context as well, and moving data around. We have to think of it as what kind of economy are we building? What kind of capabilities from a national security perspective are we building in a holistic way? And then operate along that roadmap with specific investments that are linchpin investments, critical investments as enablers, because the market will move and follow that. So I commend the current administration and their focus on AI because it's going to have a direct impact on the things we're going to be doing in the future, both in exploration as well as commercially in space, because of the autonomy that's going to be needed.
Alicia, we got a question in the chat directed at you that I would love to hear your perspective on. With the cuts to NASA's budget, including nearly 50% in science, what impact have you seen this have on emerging commercial ventures whose customers have historically used and relied on NASA's funding to support their research in orbit?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the story is written on what's going to happen in FY26 yet. Of course, we're waiting to see, what happens with the continuing resolution and larger funding after that. But certainly, I think there is concern from a number of companies about, we are very obviously just going to be doing less in space if a budget like that for science carried forward. And I think we're going to cede our position as, the leader of space science internationally. There's, and there's a number of really amazing things that have come out of SMD that have been commercialized and turned into companies, thinking about like Planet Labs, the technology that came out of Ames for that. It's hard to measure, of course, hard to prove a negative, hard to measure what we won't have, but I guarantee it will have an impact on the future companies that, people are thinking of right now.
Definitely.
I was just going to chime in real quick. I work for a large university, and a university that has a long legacy in space science and planetary science. And in recent years, the university has had our academics partner with sort of non-traditional entities. I'm thinking of the UAE mission that we helped facilitate alongside partners at LASP. So that's UC Boulder, ASU, and a foreign government who have decided to tackle space science sort of outside of the traditional channels. I think a lot of institutions out there, probably industry, academic, and government, are thinking through what does the next model look like? Are there a number of them? At least at this university, we believe that there is and that there should be a bright future for space science, and that maybe it's novel ways and novel partnerships and collaborations which can help execute that. So there's already some examples on the books, put it that way.
Yeah, I want to echo what Jonathan said, and I want to be clear, I'm in no way speaking directly to NASA administration policy as a nominee. That's not my role. I'm not doing that. But speaking as a Space Art University of Central Florida, I completely see what Jonathan is saying there. And I'll say that I think, frankly, the relationship between the federal government and university research had become unhealthy. It got to the point where more than 80%, maybe 90% of the money for university research was coming from the federal government, and the universities had lost the ability to deal with a competitive customer base. It was becoming very inbred, and people that were good at filling out federal forms were the ones that were getting the money. We can do a lot better than that. That said, I don't think this is the moment in time to be overall cutting our investment in space. Our investment in space should be growing because of the strategic challenges that we face, without getting into any one particular program. But there's a whole lot of fat in the federal government that certainly needed to be cut and can be cut. But universities and corporate researchers are going to have to find a new paradigm to make that work.
Greg, we are rapidly approaching the end of our webinar time, which is crazy because we could talk for another 2 hours at least. But I just wanted to ask each of you and kind of, give everyone their sort of their final word. I'm curious to know, now that we've had this discussion, we've had a couple questions from the audience, we've, walked through this together. What do we do now? What's next? I think it's so easy to leave one of these webinars and think, okay, so we talked about how everything is tough. What do we actually do with that? So I'd love for each of you to kind of share, what your closing thoughts are and what the next steps are in your mind, both immediately and in the future.
I don't mind kicking things off, and my answer will kind of half answer what you asked, and it'll be less prognosticative about what exactly we should do, but perhaps types of things we should be thinking about. And so here's the answer. When we were briefing this report, in front of leaders and policymakers just last month, a couple times we were asked what was in the report that isn't sort of line by line explained, but you saw as a big through line. And this is it. It's about enthusiasm. It's about multi-generational commitment. If you are a young person in China right now, maybe you're a potential engineer in college, maybe you're a potential entrepreneur, maybe in a year or two you're going to start high school. You very possibly could have the following experiences by the time you graduate. One, your country could master reusable rocketry, have its Falcon 9 moment. That'll probably, as Greg said, it's just a technological challenge. They'll figure it out. You could probably have that in the near future. You could have the international handshake moment on Tiangong, with a Pakistani astronaut shaking hands with one of your nation's astronauts. You could have the lunar landing moment, where your country lands a taikonaut on the surface of the moon, right? And it's their first time, so it's going to be absolutely plastered everywhere. It's going to be thrilling for young generations there. And the fourth is your country, very possibly, could return, as the first country to do so, samples from the Mars surface. So those experiences are not trivial. For a lot of folks that are leaders right now or chairmen of the board of aerospace companies, that might be the type of experience they point to in the history and say, that's what got me fired up. That's why I'm doing this. That's why me and my friends all changed our degrees, back in college. It's a galvanizing moment. I think the Chinese are aware of that. And if you're a young person in China right now, you could have that series of experiences. It's a powerful thing for us to consider. So what are we doing to galvanize our young generations?
Yeah, of course, the report, makes a number of specific recommendations for how we can maintain our leadership foothold. But kind of two things that I would like to, take away as we looked at how the Chinese Communist Party approaches this. This is a national priority for them. And they have, set out this direction, and every part of government of the country follows through with that. I think that's something that sometimes we struggle with, to say that this truly is a national priority and to execute on it like it is. And the other thing is that the Chinese government is very successful at taking the long view. Whereas here, we're often caught up in the fight of the day, the funding fight of the day, without making sure we have a consistent national plan and support for that plan that lasts, decades.
Greg, James, any
Yeah,
closing thoughts?
I would say it all comes down to people. I mean, I think both of the Jonathan and kind of pointed this out and getting people motivated, but I'm more near term even than that. This is a priority. The administration and I think collectively folks on the Hill are getting educated to understand it is a bipartisan security and economic priority. We need people in place in the government working with industry and our international partners to execute. It needs to be an all of government, an all of industry effort, right? But it starts with leadership, you know what I mean? And getting people in place in this administration that have the rose pinned on them to execute on this plan. And, is it a priority? If it's a priority, you apply the money you need to it and the strategy you need to it, but it's got to be executed by people. We can't continue to be in this open loop. We need people in place.
All right. Well, I don't think I'm saying anything that hasn't been said here already, but we need a sense of alacrity. We need to realize we have a real competitor, which means we do not have time to argue amongst ourselves as much as we are doing, whether that's between parties, whether that's between Congress and a White House, whether that's between individuals who have an interest in space and care passionately about it and should really be on the same side rowing together. At some point, we've got to put that away and move on, because it will be irrelevant if we don't find a way to do this. It's good that we've got a geopolitical competitor who is challenging us. Let's take that challenge seriously and win.
Well, thank you all for your participation and letting us call upon your expertise for the last hour and a half. I don't think we could have put together a more formidable panel for this. And from myself, from Beyond Earth, we really appreciate your time, your expertise, your energy on this topic. And I know Steve has a couple of closing words, but after that, we definitely hope to continue this discussion in the future, because it's certainly one that needs to continue.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Well, thank you all. It really was a fascinating and far-reaching, much farther-reaching conversation than I had expected. So, I learned a lot, and really extremely impressed by the work of the Commercial Space Federation. Really, kudos to you all. I do want to bring Courtney in here for just a minute, because Courtney, how did you think it went?
Well, I know many of the participants, so I can't say it exceeded expectations, but it was, I thought, an extraordinary discussion. And what's fascinating for the people listening is that you had people from the academic world with formidable credentials. You had a former NASA official, now with probably the leading trade association in terms of representing a cross section of the commercial industry, CSF, which is behind this report. And then you had a leading individual from industry. So I think we managed, Lauren, to bring together the key legs of the metaphorical stool. And I cannot urge everybody enough. I know everybody has limited bandwidth, but the publications of Redshift and Contested Space and Greg's brilliant and well-researched, typical of Greg's Red Moon is Rising. You read those documents, you'll have some sleepless nights, but I think you'll also have a very sober awakening as to the challenges that are facing us. Thank you, Steve. Back to you, sir.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Courtney. And I brought Lauren in here. Lauren, excellent job in guiding this conversation. Very well done. I'm going to venture a comment here, if I may. rebounding off of what Greg had said earlier, I like that we ideally we want to beat them to the moon, but more importantly, we want to beat them on the moon, right? And for all the great conversation, what I didn't hear was, well, I think that we ideally want to stick to our schedule with Artemis. There's no question about that. But don't we want to exceed what's on the drawing board with the Artemis? And this gets to what Beyond Earth is actually working on. We talked about it in previous webinars that we are developing what we're calling a case for U.S.-led a U.S.-led public-private partnership to build a lunar research facility that can house up to 50 people. It's a big, enormous goal, but I think that if we're going to really be serious about beating China and being the leader, we need to have a much bolder vision for what we're going to do on the lunar surface. And the U.S. really, through policy, needs to lead that. And I just feel like I just wanted to inject that thought into this conversation, and look forward to we'll be talking about that more as we move forward. So we're a little bit past the hour. So thank you all again. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Courtney, for putting this together. And we'll see you all again next time. We'll see you at next month for our Space Evangelist conversation. That's going to be a lot of fun and very interesting, as well as please do register for the Beyond Earth Symposium. It's at beyondearthsymposium.org. I look forward to seeing you all there. So with that, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, folks.